For decades, we've talked about the AIDS crisis as directly affecting queer men and some straight folks. But there is a group that is frequently forgotten that we do need to talk about: trans folks. Welcome back to Hear Queer and Maple Syrup, a look at queer Canadian history, an extension of my TikTok series. I'm Jacob, your host. Let's explore the AIDS crisis in Canada together. We know today that trans folks are facing so much transphobia. It was no different during the AIDS crisis. Much of the data we do have predominantly refers to, quote, men who have sex with men, as well as some data around straight folks who received the infection from a blood infusion. The classification within the queer community doesn't truly reflect the diversity of those who were diagnosed. The struggles for the trans community when it comes to AIDS is and was very different. For trans women during the 1980s, they were actively misgendered. They were categorized as, quote, men who have sex with men, despite being women. The care they received did not align with their gender identity, and the statistics don't accurately reflect this aspect of reality of the AIDS crisis. The reality for many trans women during the AIDS crisis who are marginalized, racialized, or involved in sex work was that they were severely impacted by the crisis, while at the same time being severely overlooked because of the cis-normative narrative. As for trans men, they were most at risk of being overlooked. They were not counted as, quote, men who have sex with men, despite being men. This is something that has plagued trans men for decades: their invisibility. And it means that they suffer the consequences of not only not being seen, but they are frequently and actively ignored. And it wasn't just in the healthcare system either. Many AIDS organizations would put the majority of their funding and focus onto cisgender queer men, the people who were frequently the face of the AIDS crisis. The misgendering and erasure of trans folks of all genders during the AIDS crisis goes beyond just hurting them in the room, but also skewing how we look back. Because as a society, we tend to speak in broad strokes. By misgendering trans women and forgetting trans men, we have major gaps in the gender statistics beyond the racial gaps we've talked about in previous episodes. The erasure and active discrimination that trans folks faced during the AIDS crisis still exists today. An unthinkable choice. For trans folks who did receive treatment, many had to choose between hormones that allowed them to live as themselves and life-saving treatment, though both life-saving in their own way. Many doctors, particularly those who were either actively transphobic or passively unaware, would view gender-affirming care trans folks received as unnecessary, or they considered hormone replacement therapy and HIV treatments as incompatible. There was very little effort to coordinate forms of healthcare to ensure that trans folks could remain on both forms of life-saving treatment. Because of this lack of treatment and the high rate of AIDS-related deaths in the trans community in the 1980s, there was a shift. Instead of focusing on visible activism, the trans community switched gears to community care. They realized that if AIDS support groups, the government, and the healthcare system wouldn't support them, they'd have to support themselves. It was through underground methods that trans folks could receive both hormone replacement therapy and HIV treatments. A radical yet very necessary response when ignored by so many, and when trans folks went to doctors and hospitals for treatment, they would likely be misgendered. One of the most important of the underground support networks in Toronto was a group called Maggie's. This was a sex worker-led organization that championed safe sex, harm reduction, and mutual aid from the very early days of the AIDS crisis. One of their main missions was to advocate for underserved and particularly marginalized groups within the queer community, most notably the trans community. Another prominent Ontario-based network, though it did extend its reach throughout the country, was Rupert Raj's Metamorphosis Network, which provided medical advice and general support for trans folks who were isolated in any setting, but particularly those in more rural settings like rural Ontario and even Atlantic Canada. In Atlantic Canada, any networks were incredibly informal, as they were in many other parts of the country, but not by preference, by obligation. And most of the records we have tend to be more oral histories rather than written histories. Unlike other parts of the country, AIDS Vancouver actually included trans folks early on. They even set up informal networks where members of the queer community would check in on trans folks who disappeared from their social circles out of fear or because they had been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. It's frustrating seeing the overall lack of material, even as a cisgender man. The trans community deserved so much better from us, within the community and from those outside. The fact that they were an afterthought at best or relegated to the shadows to die is terrible. Now, I'll be honest. Knowing what I knew going into the research of this episode, I was actually pleasantly surprised to find out about how AIDS Vancouver supported trans folks. A glimmer of hope against pages of institutional erasure of trans folks. Archives go beyond those physical buildings. They are family stories. They are intergenerational queer trauma. They are our oral histories. In the next episode, I'll share some of my own family stories from the AIDS crisis and explore how international politics influenced the rhetoric used here in Canada, particularly in the Atlantic provinces. Until next time.